Okay. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm happy that you guys were able to join. Today's session is an introduction to Scope 3 accounting according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I hope that some of you were able to join the last webinar hosted by my colleague Tani, who is also joining us today. And that first webinar gave a good overview and introduction into Scopes 1 and 2. So having that background knowledge will serve you well in today's webinar, but if you weren't able to attend, no worries, I'll be giving some brief background information throughout today's session as well. And as we go through today's slides, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them to the chat box. Tani will be monitoring the chat and responding as questions arise, and any ones that he's not able to get to, we can save them for the dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So I'll just take a couple moments to introduce myself. My name is Erica Barnett. I'm a senior program officer at the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, and I've been with GHGMI for about 3.5 years. My degree is in anthropology and sustainable development. I have over 5 years of experience in organizational greenhouse gas accounting, and I'm also a teaching assistant for our online course 201 Basics of Organizational Greenhouse Gas Accounting, which is a great course to take if you want to get a deeper dive into corporate inventory compilation. So if you want to chat more about that after the webinar, please feel free to ask questions or reach out to me. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and jump into our content. As I mentioned in the previous webinar, Tani went over the basics of Scope 1 and 2 emission sources, organizational and operational boundaries, accounting for greenhouse gases, etc., and ending with Scope 2. So today we're jumping back in with Scope 3. We will begin with a high-level overview of Scope 3 emissions and their importance. And then we'll shift into the associated risks and opportunities of Scope 3 emissions, moving into methodologies for accounting Scope 3 emissions, and then we will end the webinar with Scope 3 categorization. So I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this graphic. It's from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it illustrates the emission scopes and gives example emission sources for each scope. So we know that Scope 1 is all direct emissions, so emissions from stationary and mobile combustion owned by the reporting company, and Scope 2 is indirect emissions from purchased electricity. Scope 3 then is all other indirect emissions, which, as you can imagine, can include quite the breadth of emission sources and activities. Scope 3 is also divided into upstream activities, also called cradle to gate, and downstream emissions, which are referred to as gate to grave. And we are going to talk more about those terms and their associated activities later on in the webinar. So today we're discussing Scope 3 as it's defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. I just wanted to mention that the GHG Protocol also has the corporate standard, which is used for organizational GHG accounting, which we talked about in the last webinar. And they also have the corporate value chain standard, which is where many of this information in this webinar is being drawn from. So if you want a deeper dive into Scope 3 accounting after this webinar, I do recommend checking out the corporate value chain standard by the GHG Protocol to learn more. I also did want to mention that there are different standards and protocols that you can follow for a Scope 3 inventory. The GHG Protocol is probably the most widely used and well-known, but the EPA has also put out a couple of different resources for Scope 3 assessments, and Energy Star also has a couple of different tools for Scope 3 analysis. And there's also ISO, which is a comprehensive standard for organizational accounting. ISO, in the latest iteration of their standards, decided to remove the scoping categories entirely. So now they just have direct versus indirect emission sources. I just wanted to mention that so that you all are aware of the different standards that you can use. But again, today we're just focusing on the GHG protocol. So next, I'd like to discuss the capabilities of a Scope 3 inventory. Just so we're all on the same page about terminology, Scope 3 accounting can also be referred to as value chain accounting, supply chain accounting, and life cycle assessments. The first capability of a GHG Scope 3 inventory is that it can increase company understanding in value chain and product portfolio emissions. With growing demand from consumers and stakeholders for companies to have increased transparency surrounding their supply chain emissions, it's increasingly important for companies to understand their own emissions and how decisions surrounding their supply chain affect their emissions output. The second thing that a GHG Scope 3 inventory can do is that it can allow companies to identify areas for potential greenhouse gas reductions. Scope 3 is often the largest source of emissions for companies, and considering the breadth of emission sources and activities that Scope 3 can include, this isn't really surprising. Companies can also use a Scope 3 inventory to identify business risks and opportunities associated with emissions. Some examples of that include managing potential liabilities from greenhouse gas exposure, or enhancing investment and procurement decisions, and guiding product design in alignment with your carbon management and business goals. And you can also engage with supply chain partners to improve efficiency and energy efficiency, et cetera. We're going to talk more about the risks and opportunities in the next topic heading for this webinar. The fourth thing that a Scope 3 inventory can do is perhaps the most obvious. It can bolster corporate reputation. By reporting publicly, your company can meet the needs of stakeholders and improve trust in the community. So now that we've discussed the capabilities of a Scope 3 inventory, it's also important to discuss its limitations. The first being that a Scope 3 inventory cannot address avoided emissions. Avoided emissions occur outside of your value chain, but occur as a result of some activity or product within the value chain. And you can't include avoided emissions in your inventory, but you can opt to mention them in your inventory report as a memo item. They just can't interfere with the actual accounting of your emissions in your inventory. An example of avoided emissions, there are several teleconferencing platforms available now, such as Zoom and Skype, that enable employees to work from home. So they can say that they have avoided emissions from the employee's assumed commute. That's just not something that they would include within their actual emissions calculation. Which brings me to the second limitation of a Scope 3 inventory, being the inability to support the accounting of greenhouse gas emission offsets or claims of carbon neutrality. This is because an emissions inventory is literally the accounting of emissions that are emitted into the atmosphere within your boundary. And it can't account for any greenhouse gas emission reductions. And this is because accounting for greenhouse gas emission reductions requires a different type of accounting framework called project-based greenhouse gas accounting, which is quite different from what we're discussing here. The third major limitation is that Scope 3 inventories cannot be used as a performance metric in comparison with other companies. And this is due to the dynamic nature and variability of different corporate supply chains. There's little opportunity to make meaningful comparisons across inventories in this way due to those substantial differences in supply chains. So now that we've kind of gone over the big picture, we're going to talk about the risks and opportunities of Scope 3 inventories. Starting with the risks associated with Scope 3 emissions. They can be categorized into the following sections: regulatory, supply chain costs and reliability, product and technology, litigation, and reputation. Climate change presents significant financial risks for companies, such as potential liabilities from greenhouse gas exposure and unstable resources and energy costs. In reaction, companies will need to confront changing consumer preferences and a shifting regulatory landscape to address those risks. So starting with regulatory, there could be regulations that apply in different areas in which the reporting company or its supply chain partners or consumers operate. These regulations could impact the functionality of a corporate supply chain, both upstream and downstream. A recent example of this, as I'm sure you're all aware of, is the proposed regulations from the US Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which would make corporate disclosure of emission outputs mandatory. There are also risks associated with supply chain costs and reliability. Suppliers could pass higher energy or emissions-related costs to its customers. For example, future energy or emission taxes or regulations could increase the cost of goods purchased by the reporting company, which is then passed down to the consumer. The risks associated with products and technology, of course, we have been seeing a decrease in demand for products associated with higher emissions, which increases corporate competition in the marketplace. So if companies aren't prepared to shift their procurement policies to be aligned with this shifting consumer demand, they are at risk for falling behind in the marketplace. Our next risk is litigation. GHG emission-related lawsuits could be directed at the reporting company or a supply chain partner. And we've actually seen a growing number of climate-related lawsuits globally since the Paris Agreement in 2015. Sometimes these lawsuits are based on the interest of shareholders, sometimes they're based on damage to the environment or the rights of the public, and sometimes they're about specific harms caused by emissions. As an example, in 2019, a Dutch environmental organization called Milieudefensie sued Shell Oil and Gas, claiming that Shell had a duty of care for Dutch citizens, citing their country's civil code and the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees the right to life. Milieudefensie claimed that Shell was not taking adequate emission reduction steps to meet this guarantee, and then Shell was therefore unlawfully endangering lives. In 2021, Milieudefensie won this battle, and the court ordered Shell to reduce its emissions by 45% in 2030 relative to 2019 levels. Our final risk is reputation. As I've already mentioned, there is an increasing demand from companies to increase transparency around their value chain emissions. If companies don't comply with regulations or meet the demand from consumers, they could face stakeholder or consumer backlash. Now let's talk about some opportunities associated with Scope 3 emissions. The first is efficiency and cost savings. Emission reductions and cost savings often go together. As a simple example, if you retrofit a facility with LED light bulbs, you're both saving money on electricity and you're producing less emissions. Next is the opportunity for innovation. Knowing your Scope 3 emissions can provide new insights and incentives in supply chain management and product design, which can help you make informed procurement decisions. For example, after compiling your Scope 3 inventory, you target your downstream waste emissions by reducing, target your downstream waste emissions for reduction by utilizing biodegradable materials and cutting back on filler, for example. The third opportunity is increasing sales and customer loyalty. Of course, there is a lot of value placed in low emission products, so offering products aligned with customer demand can obviously increase your profits. You can also improve stakeholder relations through proactive disclosure of emissions, which can bolster their trust in your company and lead to more investment. And lastly, there's the opportunity for company differentiation. In an increasingly environmentally conscious marketplace where more and more companies are compiling their organizational inventories, having a Scope 3 emissions inventory can really help your company stand out. Our third topic for today is methodology surrounding the calculation of Scope 3 emissions. So as you're compiling your emissions inventory, Scope 3 or otherwise, it's important to have these accounting principles in the forefront of your brain throughout the inventory process. The first one being relevance, which means that you are ensuring that the greenhouse gas inventory quantification methodologies and report serves the decision-making needs of all users identified within that report. You're also presenting information in the report in a way that is readily understandable by the intended users. Next is completeness, which means that you are ensuring that the inventory report covers all product lifecycle greenhouse gas emissions and removals within a specified boundary. The next is consistency, which means you are choosing methodologies, data, and assumptions that will allow for meaningful comparisons of your greenhouse gas inventories over time. The next one is transparency, perhaps the most important one, and this means you are documenting all relevant issues, unknowns, and assumptions in a coherent manner based on a clear audit trail. You're also clearly disclosing and explaining your estimates and avoiding bias. And if you're having trouble with transparency in your inventory, just ask yourself if a third-party auditor or an unrelated party could recreate your inventory from scratch, then you know that you've achieved transparency. The last one is accuracy, which means that you are ensuring that reported greenhouse gas emissions and removals are not systematically greater than or less than actual emissions and removals, and uncertainties are reduced as far as practical. You're also achieving sufficient accuracy to enable users to make decisions within reasonable assurance as to the reliability of the reported information. So now that you know the accounting principles, let's go over which gases are required by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to include in the Scope 3 inventory. Some of these, especially the bottom three, might not apply to your supply chain, but given the scope of supply chains, don't be surprised if all of these are found in your inventory. So I know we're all familiar with the top three: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, but the last three might be a little bit unfamiliar, so I'll just touch on those briefly. Hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, are commonly used in air conditioning and refrigeration, and you may find yourself accounting for fugitive HFCs in your inventory, which means that they have leached from refrigeration or conditioning equipment. Sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, is commonly produced in industrial processes, particularly in the making of electronics or semiconductors, as well as in transmission and distribution equipment. And fluorofluorocarbons, or PFCs, are typically produced in the aluminum industry. So now that you know what to include in your inventory and the guiding principles, let's go over the steps for inventory compilation. And this process is extremely similar to compiling an organizational emissions inventory, with just a couple of defining features for Scope 3. So first, you'll just establish your GHG accounting team and design your inventory. You'll need to identify personnel responsible for compiling the inventory, including identifying funding needed and management support. Next, you'll define your business goals. Consider the risks and opportunities that we discussed earlier, and ask yourself, why are you compiling this inventory? What data are you hoping to get from this inventory, and how will that help you attain your business goals? Third, you'll review the accounting principles that we discussed a couple slides ago. And then you'll define your Scope 3 boundary, which is something we're going to discuss on the next slide. Then you'll identify the activities that fall within that boundary, which is also known as mapping your value chain. We're also going to go over this on the next slide, and it is specific to a Scope 3 inventory. Next, you'll compile your relevant activity data, apply the appropriate emission factors to calculate your emissions, and then you'll report your emissions in accordance with whichever protocol you're using. So mapping your value chain is probably the hardest or most time-consuming part of putting together a Scope 3 inventory. First, you'll need to consider your consolidation approach, which is something that Tani went over in the last webinar. So I won't get too far into it, but basically you'll need to use the equity or control consolidation approach to set your organizational boundaries, which will then define your operational boundaries, meaning which activities fall under your scopes 1, 2, or 3. And then you'll focus on just the Scope 3 emission sources. You map your value chain by developing a list of purchased goods and services, sold goods and services, and a list of suppliers and partners. This can be very difficult and tedious given the extent and scope of most supply chains. So if you're having trouble, start by thinking about your biggest product line, or which activities produce the most emissions, or activities that contribute to your company's risk exposure, and activities that are critical for stakeholders. Supply chains, as you all know, are also extremely dynamic. So if you have a supply chain that changes periodically throughout the reporting year, you can choose to pick a specific date in that year and then apply those parameters to the entire reporting year, so you don't have to chase down all of the suppliers and partners that you had throughout the year. I'll also mention that companies have the ability to exclude some Scope 3 activities if it makes sense to do so. Those decisions just need to be clearly disclosed and justified in your inventory report. Some categories, which is something we are going to get into a little bit later in the webinar, might not be applicable to your company, but the most common reason to exclude an activity is because you don't have reliable data or enough data for that activity, or the activity is assumed to produce insubstantial emissions. So let's take a look at an example inventory. This is Apple's emissions inventory from 2019. As you can see, they have clearly been making efforts to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, with those equaling almost 0% of their total inventory. But 76% of their carbon footprint is made up from product manufacturing. So this category is clearly the biggest risk and opportunity for Apple to reduce emissions in their supply chain. Important to note at this point is that this is not a mitigation assessment, but you can use an inventory to target potential mitigation measures. And this is another graph from Apple that was published in 2020. You can see that their emissions have decreased about 40% since their base year inventory in 2015, and they do have a net zero carbon emissions goal by 2030, and you can see their projected emissions there on the right side. So we've arrived at our last and biggest topic for today, the 15 categories of Scope 3. As I mentioned near the beginning of the webinar, Scope 3 emissions are either upstream or downstream emissions. Upstream Scope 3 emissions are also called cradle to gate, and it refers to all emissions that occur in the life cycle of purchase projects up until the point of receipt by the company. This excludes any sources owned by the company, as those would have already been reported as Scope 1 or 2. So this includes extraction of raw materials, manufacturing, production and processing of materials, generation of electricity consumed by those upstream activities, disposal and treatment of waste generated by upstream activities, as well as the transportation of materials and products between suppliers. Downstream emissions are called gate to grave emissions, and it refers to the point of sale by the reporting company until disposal or end of life treatment by the end user, starting with the processing of the sold product from the reporting company, the transportation and distribution of the product, the use of the sold product by the consumer, and then the end of life treatment. So these are all of the 15 categories of Scope 3. As you can see, they're disaggregated by upstream and downstream. The first 8 are upstream, and 9 through 15 are downstream. Categories are mutually exclusive to avoid double counting of emissions in the same category. And companies are required to report their Scope 3 emissions by category if they are abiding by the corporate value chain standard from the GHG Protocol. I do have a slide for each category, so we'll be learning about all of them today. Starting with purchased goods and services. This upstream activity refers to intermediate goods and final goods purchased by the reporting company. You'll be accounting the emissions associated with any upstream activities of those products. Intermediate goods are goods that require further transformation or inclusion in another product before use by the end consumer. For example, let's say your company is an automaker. You procure car motors from a third party. The motors that you receive are an intermediate good, and the emissions associated with manufacturing of those motors would be accounted for within this category. Final goods, on the other hand, are goods consumed by the end user in their current form without further processing or transformation. This can also include any products that are used by the reporting company. An example is any office supplies used by the reporting company that are purchased from a third company. So when you're accounting emissions, first check to see if your suppliers have compiled an emissions inventory. Their Scope 1 and 2 emissions would be your Scope 3 emissions for these purchased goods and services. This is called the supplier-based method, and it is the preferred method if you're able to do it. If the supplier doesn't have this data, or if you can't get this data for some reason, you can use activity data from your company in the form of the weight of purchased goods, which is called the average data method, or the economic value of the goods and services purchased, which is called the spend-based method. In the last two approaches, you would multiply the activity data by the relevant industry average emissions factor. So the average emissions per unit or per weight, or per monetary value of the good in question. The second category is capital goods. This refers to final products with an extended life and are not immediately consumed or further processed by the reporting company. These goods are used in their current form and are used to manufacture a product, provide a service, sell, store, or deliver merchandise. Examples can include equipment, machinery, buildings, and vehicles. There is often a fair amount of ambiguity between this category and the first category, and it can be tricky to determine which goods belong where. But keep in mind that you never put the same emissions into multiple categories. This avoids double counting of the emissions within your inventory. Also important to note is that capital goods tend to depreciate over time. In this case, companies should not depreciate or discount the emissions over time as well. Instead, companies should account for the total cradle to gate emissions of the good in question within the year of acquisition. The approaches for accounting emissions from capital goods are the same as the first category, so you can gather supplier-specific data from their inventories, or you can calculate the emissions via weight or monetary value. Our next category is fuel and energy-related activities. This refers to emissions that are related to the production of fuels and energy purchased by the reporting company that aren't already included in scopes 1 or 2. Grid emission factors for purchased electricity, such as those provided by the US EPA's eGrid, only include emissions from combustion of a fuel and do not include T&D losses or upstream fuel extraction. So emissions associated with T&D losses, upstream emissions of purchased fuel and electricity, as well as generation of purchased electricity that is sold to end users are accounted for within this category. This category is particularly relevant for utility companies that purchase wholesale electricity supplied by independent power producers for resale to their customers. To account for emissions in this inventory, you'll either gather supplier-specific data from the fuel providers on upstream emissions, so the emissions associated with extraction, production, and transportation, or you can use the average data method, in which you estimate emissions using the industry average of emissions emitted per unit of consumption. For example, total kilograms of CO2 equivalent emitted per kilowatt hour. Our next category is upstream transportation and distribution. This refers to the emissions produced from the transportation and distribution of products purchased by the reporting company within the reporting year. Examples of transport include air, rail, marine, and road transport. And this category also includes storage in warehouses and distribution centers. To calculate emissions from this category, you can use the fuel-based method in which you'll account for, in which you will need the amount of fuel consumed per supplier, as well as the emission factor for that fuel. Or you can also use the distance-based method in which you'll need the mass, distance, and mode of each shipment, as well as the relevant emissions factor for the vehicle. Or you could use the spend-based method in which you will need the amount of money spent on each mode of business transport and applying the appropriate vehicle-specific emissions factor. The next category is waste generated in operations, which refers to the emissions from third-party disposal and treatment of waste that is generated by the reporting company within the reporting year. This includes disposal in landfills, recovery for recycling, incineration, composting, and wastewater treatment. Important to note that there is also a category for downstream end-of-life treatment, which is different from this category, and we'll talk about a little bit later. But to avoid double counting, it's important to be mindful of which emissions you're allocating to this category. You can gather supplier-specific data for this category as well in the form of allocated scope 1 and 2 emissions from the supplier. If you don't have this data, or if you can't get this data, you can also use a waste type specific method in which you account emissions according to the type of waste disposed, for example, cardboard, food waste, wastewater, et cetera, as well as the waste treatment method, like incineration, landfill, recycling, wastewater, et cetera. For this method, you will need the amount of waste produced disaggregated by type of waste and type of treatment. You can also use the average data method, in which you should collect data based on the total waste diversion rates from the reporting company. I'll just say that this method should only be used when the type of waste produced is unknown. Category 6 is business travel, and this refers to emissions from transportation of employees for business-related activities in vehicles that are not owned by the reporting company. Also included in this category is emissions from employees staying in hotels. Important to note that not included in this category are emissions from employee commuting, which is the next category, nor does it include emissions from leased vehicles, which is category 8. To calculate emissions within this category, you'll need the miles traveled or gallons of fuel used, as well as the types of vehicles being used and the type of fuel. You can then multiply the activity data by the vehicle and fuel specific emission factor. If neither fuel type nor distance data are available, you can also use the spend-based method, in which you'll need the monetary amount spent on each mode of transport. Category 7, as I mentioned, is employee commuting. This accounts for the emissions from employees traveling to and from work and vehicles not owned by the reporting company. You can also include emissions from home office use in this category. The same calculation methods from category 6 can be applied here. Our last upstream category is emissions from upstream leased assets. In this category, you put the emissions from assets that your company does not own, but leases from another entity. This is applicable to buildings, vehicles, machinery, equipment, etc. To calculate emissions, you can either gather the emissions data from the leaser, the owner, which is the preferred method, or you can use the average data method, which involves estimating the emissions for each leased asset based on an average data amount, such as the average emissions per asset type or floor space. So before we move into our downstream categories, I have 3 scenarios that I'd like for you all to respond to. I'll read the scenario and then please input your answer choice into the chat box. These scenarios for right now all only have to do with upstream emissions. So scenario 1, company R is a toy manufacturer compiling an emissions inventory. Company R purchases motors from company T to be used in their manufacturing equipment. In accounting the upstream emissions from the production of these motors, in which category do the associated emissions belong? Is it capital goods, upstream leased assets, purchased goods and services, transportation and distribution, or is it fuel and energy related activities? So I'll just give you guys a few moments to please input your answer choice into the chat box. Okay, so yes, the answer is A, capital goods. This is because the motors are purchased by company R and are being used to manufacture other products by the reporting company. So it would be C if the motors weren't being used to manufacture other goods. So the second scenario, company X is using the operational control consolidation approach to compile their inventory. Company X has several employees that travel around the US for work. The company leases vehicles from company Y for these employees to use for work travel. In which category do these associated emissions belong? Is it business travel, upstream transportation and distribution, employee commuting, upstream leased assets, or are these emissions actually scope 1 for company X? I'll give you guys a few moments. Okay, the answer is D, upstream leased assets. This is because company X is leasing the vehicles from company Y for work travel. If they weren't leasing the vehicles, then it would be a business travel. Okay, scenario number 3. Company B is a virtual organization that does not own any buildings or facilities. They're using the operational control consolidation approach. All of their employees work remotely. The company wants to account emissions associated with home office use. In which category do these associated emissions belong? Are these emissions actually scope 1? Do they belong in employee commuting, fuel and energy related activities, capital goods, or does this activity actually not produce any emissions? Well, please input your answer choice into the chat. Okay, so these emissions belong in employee commuting. Because the company is a virtual organization, it doesn't own any buildings or facilities or vehicles, and they are using the operational control consolidation approach. Their emissions are definitely scope 3. And if you recall from category 7 slide, employee commuting can be included, or excuse me, employees working remotely can be included within the employee commuting category. So that's why it's B. Okay, let's go into downstream categories, starting with downstream transportation and distribution. You'll recall that we also have an upstream transportation and distribution category. The difference here is that these emissions are from the transportation and distribution of a sold product from the reporting company to the end user, which includes retail and storage. So these are the emissions after the reporting company pays to transport and distribute its products. Accounting for these emissions in the category is basically the same as category 4, upstream transportation and distribution. Although you are more likely to apply the average data method for this category because it's typically more difficult to get exact data from downstream transportation than it is to get it from suppliers. Category 10 is processing of sold products, which includes emissions from the processing of intermediate products that are sold in the reporting year by downstream companies. Usually this means manufacturers. For example, if your company makes auto parts and then sells the components to automakers, your company would include the emissions from the automaker processing your products in this category. From your downstream value chain partners, you'll need to collect the relevant activity data such as fuel use, electricity, refrigerant use, and waste, as well as the relevant emission factors for each of those downstream processes. The 11th category is the use of sold products, which refers to the emissions from the use of goods and services by end users, sold by the reporting company within the reporting year. This includes both direct and indirect use phase emissions. Direct use phase emissions are from products that directly consume energy during use, such as cars, facilities, and appliances. And these are required within a scope 3 inventory if you're following the guidance from the GHG protocol. Indirect use phase emissions, on the other hand, are from products that indirectly consume energy, such as apparel and soaps, which indirectly consume energy via their water usage. And including these is optional within your inventory. This category includes the total expected lifetime emissions from all relevant products sold within the reporting year, which effectively produces a GHG impact assessment for the products. You'll likely need to make some assumptions about how users are using your product when calculating your emissions in this category. Activity data will vary depending on the product, but you will likely need the total lifetime expected of the product, the quantities of each product sold, the fuel use or electricity needed per product, as well as any refrigerant leakage per use of the product. Category 12, end of life treatment of sold products, is another category that will likely require some more assumptions than the previous categories. You'll need to assume how the products are being treated at the end of the product's life. In this category, you should allocate emissions from waste disposal and treatment of products sold within the reporting year. You'll need to collect the total mass of sold products and packaging from the point of sale to the end of life after consumer use. This includes packaging used in transport of the products through the point of retail, as well as any packaging that is disposed of prior to the end of life treatment of the final product. You'll also need to have a proportion of waste that is being treated by the different methods, such as percent landfilled, percent incinerated, or percent recycled, etc. Category 13 is downstream leased assets. This refers to any emissions from lessees occurring during the operation of a leased asset, such as emissions occurring from an office building that the reporting company owns and leases to a tenant. These emissions will likely already be categorized as Scope 1 within your inventory, in which case you wouldn't account for them within your Scope 3 emissions, especially if you're using the operational control consolidation approach, because you would own the asset in question. But it does depend on your consolidation approach as well as your contractual arrangement that you have with the lessee. The calculation approaches for this category are the same as the upstream leased assets category. Our 14th category is franchises. A franchise is defined as a business operating under a license to sell or distribute another company's goods or services within a certain location. And this category is only applicable to franchisors, meaning the companies that grant the licenses to other entities to sell its goods in return for payment. The emissions from franchises would be considered Scope 1 or 2 from the company that operates the franchise, but they are Scope 3 category 14 for the company that owns the franchise. So that's a good example of a difference between ownership versus operation. The last category is investments. This category is particularly relevant for companies that provide financial services, such as private or public financial institutions like banks, as well as investors. Included in this category are the emissions associated with equity or debt investments. These could be considered Scope 1 or 2 if you're using the equity share consolidation approach. Otherwise, they belong in Scope 3 category 15. To calculate emissions in this category, ideally, you would have access to the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the company that you're investing in, as well as your proportional share of equity in that company. But if you don't have access to this data, you can also find the revenue generated by the company that you're investing in, depending on its sector, and then apply the proportion of equity that your company has in that investment. So those are all of the Scope 3 categories. And I have a couple more scenarios that I'll ask you guys that are related to downstream emissions. So the first one, oh, whoops, sorry about that. We'll just go through it together. Company A is an apparel manufacturer compiling a Scope 3 emissions inventory using a control consolidation approach. Right now, they are focused on their gate to grave emissions. They are counting their emissions from consumer behavior with their products. Company A assumes consumers will launder their products regularly. So in which category do these associated emissions belong? They do belong in the use of sold products. And if you wanted to get more specific, you could call those indirect use phase emissions. Since the clothes themselves don't produce emissions, but washing them does produce emissions. Okay, the fifth scenario, Company Y is a financial institution using the equity share approach to compile their inventory. Company Y has 60% equity in Company B and wants to know the carbon intensity of that investment. In which category do these associated emissions belong? Is it investments, franchises? This activity does not produce emissions, downstream leased assets, transportation and distribution, or are these emissions actually scope 1 for category Y? So I'll give you all a few moments, but please input your answer choice into the chat box. Okay, so the answer is that these emissions are actually scope 1 for company Y, and it's important to pay attention to what consolidation approach the company is using to account their emissions. If you recall from the slide discussing the investments category, if a company is using the equity share approach, then any emissions that they have invested equity into a company, those emissions would be considered scope 1 within their inventory. If they were using any other consolidation approach, the answer would be A, investments. But that one was a little bit tricky. So, okay, well, that's the end of the webinar. And before we get into our Q&A session, I did just want to direct you to a couple of different resources. I would love to invite you to become a member of GHGMI, which is free to do. And in doing so, you can participate in our experts forum and gain access to the Carbon Management Journal. And you can do that at ghginstitute.org/join us. You can also take one of our online courses. We have a lot of different courses that focus on different areas of carbon management. So I invite you to take a look through our course curricula, and please reach out to me if you have any questions about our courses, or if you have further thoughts about this webinar or any questions. Please feel free to reach out. My email is there on the screen, erica.barnett@ghginstitute.org. And with that, I would love to hear what questions you have. So feel free to put them in the chat, or you can speak up either way.
Erica, I just want to make a point that I did send my questions to you earlier. I'm not being silent. I did send questions.
Sure, yeah, we can go over those now. Is there one that you wanted me to lead with?
Yeah, no, not really. Any of them is fine.
Okay.
Plus, Sandy also sent some in too.
Yeah, I think I have your questions too, Sandy. So I have a question here, and I'm not sure if it was from Preston or Sandy, but it says, in the presentation on May 17th, Tani showed a slide depicting several voluntary reporting programs, such as TCR, CDP, EPA, CERIS, etc. Are the different programs geared towards different industries or pollutants, or are they all equivalent? Is there any advantage or disadvantage for utilizing one over the other? So to my knowledge, I don't think that there are different GHG reporting programs for different industries or pollutants, but the main thing to consider when you're choosing a voluntary reporting program are the reporting requirements themselves. Programs will definitely require different things of your inventory. Some programs might have a specific format that you need to report your inventory in, or some might have different requirements surrounding your base year. So it's important to vet the program that you're planning to report to before you start your inventory so that you know what the requirements are. And I'll mention that you should also consider the reputation of the reporting program and the recognition that that will bring you by reporting to them. For example, the Climate Registry is a pretty well recognized reporting program in this space, and they have a specific program within their registry that's kind of like a virtual badge that communicates to others your commitment in climate action and in reporting your emissions.
Just a question related to that. CDP, if I understand this correctly, has 25 questions that are asked that are directly go into, I think it's SASB for financial reporting of risks. So I guess that would be something unique to them as far as the reporting requirements if you want to report via their organization.
Yeah, that's another good example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that.
So everybody then is prepped for addressing the investment community and the trading community, stock trading communities in one fell swoop.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Yeah.
Thank you, Erica. That was actually my question about the voluntary reporting programs. So based on your answer, it does sound like depending on the industry that you're in and the type of greenhouse gases or pollutants or otherwise, some of the programs are more preferable to others. And what I guess the idea is to look at them all and find out which one matches up best. Do you have any information about, given the industry, which one of those programs would be best by industry, let's say?
That is a great question. Yeah, to be honest, voluntary reporting programs, I don't know a ton about them in depth. So let me do some internal questioning and I can get back to you via email.
Okay,
That's a
thank
good
you.
question though.
It was actually from Tani's presentation several weeks ago.
Yeah, Tani, if you have a response, feel free.
No, I've got the same response as you. Would love to do a little research to understand that better. Maybe ask our experts forum if anyone has thoughts.
Yeah, that is a good question for the experts forum. But yeah, Sandy, let us get back to you on that one.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
They have your email address because I forwarded the email, Cindy. So, but I do know and I'm not sure, I can't remember what organizations are merging. It looks like some of the organizations that have overlap have agreed to merge. I've forgotten which one has done that, but so if there's duplication, it looks like people are moving on their own to, not to be redundant, but to kind of reinforce the value proposition that each brings. So there's considerable overlap. And again, I can't remember which ones have recently done that, but that is occurring within those that are supporting the whole, the all war on carbon emissions.
Mhm. So I have another question, I think, from Sandy here that says, I am assuming that Erica will be discussing the various scope 3 indirect downstream activities in detail. Please give some specific examples by industry of what these activities are. How does one go about collecting information about downstream activities? So I did try to touch on the different activity data that you would need for each category. And as you can imagine, that it varies significantly depending on which category you're accounting for and which method you're using. But typically gathering activity data will mean that you're surveying or otherwise communicating with your suppliers and customers. Especially for downstream emissions, I think a great deal of assumptions will need to be made when compared against upstream emissions. And if gathering activity data from your suppliers isn't an option, then you can use industry average data depending on the category. The GHG protocol does have a technical guidance document for each category and has data collection recommendations. So if you're stuck in a category and you're not sure how to get that data, they do provide suggestions to move forward.
Well, thank you for that. Actually, I felt that you answered number 2 quite well in your talk. My real question is number 3, though.
Okay.
What about companies demonstrating a positive ROI? You did show that slide from Apple, which I thought was really interesting. looks like they did a Pareto analysis to to look at where their most offensive operations obviously would be manufacturing. Uh,
Mhm.
how do you are you aware of companies? And this, I'm opening this to everybody. Are there any companies that have gone through all this and have been able to demonstrate a net reduction in greenhouse gases or other pollutants and have been able to demonstrate a positive monetary ROI in doing so? And I guess the reason I ask that is that that's the message that we need to sell, I think, to companies in the United States and around the world. That there's a good reason, not just for cleaning up the earth, but there's also a net positive ROI, either in the long run or mid run, not short run, to do these activities.
All right. I can answer that, but it's a bit dated. About 10 years ago, the Carbon Disclosure Project undertook with a major consultancy, and I'd have to look it up. In fact, I've incorporated in a presentation I did at that time. I probably could give you the name of the consultancy. But they looked at two things. One was with the existing technology that we had at the time, if everybody was totally committed, could we in fact meet the goals of carbon emission reductions, GHG reductions? And the answer was yes. It's just been a matter of commitment. But the second one was really focused in on the ROI of projects dedicated to GHG carbon reduction versus standard ROI, standard improvement projects. And they said that the GHG reduction projects had a significantly better ROI than traditional projects, buy a piece of new equipment just to improve productivity or whatever the case may be. So they found that it wasn't an investment that returned no ROI. In fact, this type of project focused on cleaning up emissions produced a better ROI. And I'll dig that up, Sandy, as best I can, because most of my stuff is just kind of scattered over a number of things, and I'll get it to you. But it was the Carbon Disclosure Project with a major consultancy, and it was a pretty in-depth evaluation and study.
Very good. Thank you, Preston.
I did want to mention that it's also somewhat difficult to measure a net reduction in the atmosphere in emissions if you're compiling an attributional inventory. And this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but basically you have attributional versus consequential inventories. The first one, attributional, which is what we're talking about here, you are only accounting the emissions that fall within your inventory boundary. And it doesn't necessarily account for emissions reductions or emissions additions that occur as consequences of the decisions made within your inventory boundary to the atmosphere. And that's something that a consequential inventory is trying to capture. So just by nature of the accounting framework, it is a little bit difficult to, I guess, kind of display that net reduction. We actually have a good blog piece on our website that goes into the differences. Tani, actually, would you mind dropping the link to that blog post real quick?
Well, I think in the future, we're going to have a Bert, who I think I've mentioned Bert before. He's going to go over the hidden costs of emissions and SASB and all the other requirements, financial requirements that are being, financial risk requirements that will apply to companies are being mandated on trading exchanges, et cetera, of the whole ecosystem like that. And that'll be in about 2 months from now, 2 or 3 months from now. So
interesting.
we'll have some, yeah. He's been going at it for 20 or 30 years, so he was a pioneer in this stuff. So we'll have him give a webinar probably in September.
Oh, great. I also wanted to mention Patagonia. I think they're a good example of companies who have demonstrated that their mitigation efforts are effective within their inventory. And I mean, Patagonia has long been revered in the climate change, climate action space for their efforts and their transparency. I think they discovered that like 97% of their emissions come from their supply chain, specifically from virgin material extraction and manufacturing. And they've actually committed to financing energy and emissions audits for supply chain partners, which improves energy and resource efficiency. And they're also implementing renewable energy to manufacture their materials. And they are committed to using recycled materials, et cetera. So I think that in terms of companies making efforts in their own inventories, Patagonia is a good example of that.
Just chip into, I think IKEA is another good example of a company that's like got its emissions are pretty large in terms of scope 3 and purchased goods, and they've done a lot of work working throughout their supply chain. But I think the other way that that question of ROI is being looked at pretty significantly right now is from the investment lens, and the interest from investors to find climate beneficial investments, I think is one of the growing areas within investment portfolios currently. So there's a lot of movement on it. I don't know if there's so much certainty from a greenhouse gas accounting perspective around, yes, there's a lot of interest, a lot of money going in that direction, but you know, what are the, how certain are we that the investments that are being made are going to companies that are going to lead to like high environmental integrity, climate outcomes? There's a little less certainty there just because the accounting is less not as well established.
Thanks, Tani. Yeah, it's good to mention. Okay, I have another question here. I think this one might be from Preston. It says, how are the organizations and companies with early adopter experience with the greenhouse gas protocol assisting their suppliers in adopting scope 1 and 2? So for this, I would say that it's less about persuading current suppliers to account their emissions output directly and more about companies indirectly influencing suppliers to do so via the demand for those suppliers. So environmentally conscious companies are paying more and more attention to their supply chain partners and are selecting partners based on their efforts in climate action as well. Although I'm sure there are also companies that incentivize their suppliers through some sort of either with like direct financing or maybe like some sort of marketing initiatives like raising their brand awareness. So I'm sure that happens too, but I would say it's more indirect than that.
Can I make a comment? This is a bit dated, but I remember as far back as almost 10 years ago, Walmart had its own portal embedded in the Carbon Disclosure Project's overall vault of reports. And I guess that meant that they were mandating their suppliers to go in and post the reports through that portal and to the GHG and to the CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project portal. So Walmart really consumes a lot of products. So apparently I don't think that was wasn't by invitation. I'm sure they probably demanded that, but I'm not fully sure of that. But that was as long ago as 10 years ago. So there have been a lot of aggressive companies that you might not think are that aggressive, but Walmart in this case happens to be one of them.
That's a great example. Thanks, Preston. That's one that I hadn't thought of.
Yep. In fact, the CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, is recommending to all those who post their GHG annual reports, protocol reports, that they include at least 50% from scope 3. They want to see 50% of the total emissions coming from scope 3. So now they're suggesting it, strongly suggesting it. And so that's a subtle move toward soon it's going to be mandatory. So who knows when, but it won't be 10 years from now. It's going to be, and pretty soon, 2, 3, 4 years out, 5 years out, who can guess? But 50%, suggesting 50% means that they're going to have to really reach hard and put a lot of effort into compiling that kind of inventory. So I think it's on the horizon that it's going to, reporting is going to be forced on suppliers, not mandatory in the future. But that's my opinion. Just I'm reading the tea leaves.
Yeah. Oh, I think you're right too. I agree with you. I think I indirectly answered the other questions that you sent me, but if there are any others that anyone has, please feel free to speak up.
Yeah. Dina, you said that you were here because it was very important. Got any questions? Oh, I scared her off.
Actually, she had to drop off. She sent me a message that she got called into something. She stayed on in case she could jump back in.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Yeah.
Could we get a copy of the slides?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Preston, I can send you this slideshow.
Right. That and also the video of this, the Zoom link will be sent out as well.
Perfect.
Well, are we near the end of the Q&A period?
Let's see, what time is it? I think, yeah, I guess we are approaching the end.
Okay.
15 after the hour was.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
about it. Can I just show a slide or two?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Just in conclusion, and plus I want to thank you for all the great things that you've done here right now. So let me go. Can I share my screen now?
I think so. I stopped sharing, so you should be able to.
Okay. Okay, let me just whoops, I didn't want to do that. I apologize, folks, bear with me. I've done it again. Part of the problem is that header that they have up here blocks what you see.
And while we're waiting, I also wanted to echo the comment of the good exercises. I was not very confident in my answers, and I felt like it helped me better understand the conversation and where upstream and downstream and where to associate those costs. So I think I'll be revisiting those slides just to help ingrain that into my head. It was a lot of information for me, especially since I don't know that much and it's all really new. But I really enjoyed those questions and thought they were well written as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that feedback. Yeah, and those are more to give an example of some of the more like complex situations that you might find yourself in. So as Tani mentioned, most of the time categorizing your scope 3 emissions will be much easier than that. But I'm happy that it was give you guys an idea.
Okay. Well, for whatever reason, my PowerPoint's not acting up, so I can't give you the slide view. But here, hopefully, you can see my slide. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see.
Okay.
Yep.
The good news is now we've covered SCORE, we've covered the GHG protocol, and on July 18th, we're going to have a solid overview from one of the founders of the Water Footprint Network. It'll be an hour long. It'll be at noon again. In this case, it wasn't just a choice of time. It's a necessity because it'll be live from the Netherlands. And all the information about it will be up and posted and available for registration within the next week. So you might want to look out for that, and we'll send information out at that time as well. And I'd like to really thank Erica and Tanny for really a great introduction to the GHG protocol, scopes 1, 2, and 3. And we hope to see you again. I've enjoyed, I'm sure everybody's enjoyed their presentations, and I've liked working with them just to get organized to do this. There's really a nice group of people. You both are real professionals, and I find the GHG Institute to be a really fantastic asset for those who want to learn more about GHG emissions and what to do about it and who can help you. So thank you again for your time. And let me end my slide. I don't know why that didn't come up correctly, but it'll do it as soon as I stop sharing it.
Yeah, yep, exactly. Well, thank you, Preston, for reaching out to GHGMI. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to deliver these webinars, and we hope that you stay in touch.
We will. And I think people should take your recommendation of looking to those pre-developed courses. The one was it 201?
201 is our introduction into organizational accounting. So if
Right,
you want to learn
right.
more about corporate inventory processes, then I
Right.
recommend that one.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to looking into that. Thank you again for your time, and hope to see you, both of you, again soon.
Great. Thanks, Preston. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Hope to see you all again soon.
Take it easy. Have a good week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.